So I titled it Non-Uniform Jewelry because that's really what we're going to talk about. This is not about the rank insignia that was used on uniforms. So in the early days, Scouting being a new organization, it needed something as a way to promote Scouting when the uniform was not worn. So they came up with this wonderful marketing idea of creating jewelry, and this is high-end jewelry. This is not cheap cosmetic stuff. And then they sold it to the members and asked the members to wear it and promote the organization when they weren't in uniform. Fantastic marketing program for an early organization. So before we actually get into the pins, let's talk a little bit about some of the terms we're going to use. So the first one is the term enamel jewelry. So enameling goes back, it's an ancient art form, and it's actually powdered glass that's put onto metal and then fired either through a torch or through a kiln to 1450 degrees that melts the glass and adheres it to the metal. And the most commonly used metal in this is copper. And most of the pins that we're going to talk about tonight have an underlying metal of copper. So this is not about painting. This is not about getting your brush out and painting in and letting it dry. This is about actually having high-end, tiny powdered glass that's then heated and melted. The next thing we need to talk about is another term, and that is called jewelry findings. So when jewelry's made, you make the initial piece, which a lot of times is called the brooch, where you have the emblem on it, and it has the color melted glass fired onto it. And then there has to be something attached to it in order for that to be used. That attachment is called a finding. So if you go out and were to go to a jewelry supply and say, I want a whatever Scouting calls a clasp or a post or whatever, they look at you and go, so you want a finding? And then what type of finding? So here are some examples of all different kinds of findings, and there are thousands of findings that can be used. Scouting used some very specific ones that we're going to talk about. So those two terms, enamel and finding, you'll see in this presentation during the course of the evening. Now, let's talk about West needing this promotional campaign, and where did he go? Well, Scouting was in New York at 200, well, let's just look at the map, at 205th Street. Just around the corner was this jewelry company called T.H.Foley. It was only a 3-minute walk from the headquarters that West could talk to and talk about the problem that he had of how do we get people to promote Scouting when they're not in uniform? How do we get people to recognize the Scouting emblem? How do we get those conversations started so people will want to get going? So he approached Foley and presented the problem. Foley had some great ideas. Being a jewelry company, they said, how about a pin? So this is the first Foley pin from 12. And it's in red, white, and blue. It's a shield emblem. You know, it was the first one that was created. It's flat. It was copper that was struck with much like a coin, and then the coloring is glass powder that's put in those areas, and then it's fired, and you get this brilliant, wonderful badge. Okay, now this is the genesis of all of them. From here, we started to look. They started to look at, well, that's interesting, but it's only one piece. And what could be more interesting and what could be more promoting than this one piece? So in 1912, in the Boy's Life, was an advertisement for the first introduction of jewelry that scouters, not scouts, but scouters, adults, could buy. And you can see here, they're advertising the new style scarf or lapel pin and the gold and enamel badges. And up in the upper right and left-hand corner are some pictures, drawings, if you will. So we launch into now this jewelry ad campaign that scouters could buy and wear, okay? So let's get real on how big these things are first. So we think about pins and jewelry, and it's like, well, these are in relation to that quarter. So that quarter, think about its size, and then you think about all of these pins and how big they actually are. Now, if you reduce that down and you think about that in badge, that pin, and you look at all of those intricate colors in there, if you're thinking about as a jeweler, how do I get those individual colors and that powder inside that little bit of area so it can then be fired? This is not, you know, weekend craft stuff. This is finely crafted jewelry, okay? So this gives you some representation of size. So in the ad, remember, if we look back at the ad, it talked about these cutout first-class pins, which are in the upper left-hand corner, and the oval pins, which are in the right-hand corner. So the first enameled pins that came out in the cutout design, there was a pin for every position and a color to match the badge. So if you were Assistant Scoutmaster, you bought a red one. If you were Scoutmaster, you bought a green one, and so forth and so on. Now, an important thing to remember is back in the day, no one was trying to go, and the red is always going to be exactly the same red. So there's shades of red, there's shades of green, there's shades of blue. The idea here, though, is because they were different enough in color, you could distinguish when you saw that person wearing this on their collar, going to church, or at their men's club, or wherever. You would see this and go, wow, that's an interesting badge. Tell me about it. And why is it that color? And you could talk about positions. Now, in addition to this, Foley created these ovals. Now, this is kind of interesting because the shape of the fleur-de-lis is pretty crude looking. And again, these came in two styles. They came in a lapel pin, and we'll talk about those, and they came in a button pin. Now, think about that. If you're wearing a men's jacket, a suit jacket, you've got a lapel that's got a hole in it. So you're going to put what's called a button pin through that. It's going to be a post with a screw on the back. We'll see that in a moment. Or if you're wearing a shirt or something, you might want one that has a pin back where you can pin it on. So again, the same, all the different colors. The findings on the back for these early Foley pieces, the lapel pins had a hook and a wire. The button pins had this post with these big screws, and those nuts, if you will, are in proportion to the pin. They're really big, the ones that actually came with it, and many times you'll find them with some replacement that somebody's put on them, but the original ones were big in their shape. So in addition to what was available for men, it was interesting in that they created scarf pins. Now, who in scouting back in the early teens, would wear a scarf. Some men maybe, but mostly women. So these pins came as scarf pins also, so that you could, put the scarf on and then pin it closed. Now, all of the Foleys came with what are called smooth length pins. Hallmarks, all of the ones I have in my collection do not have hallmarks. I don't know if Mitch has any in his that has hallmarks or not. But this is one of those things where it's sort of willy-nilly as to whether it has a hallmark or doesn't have a hallmark. Sometimes they had them, sometimes they don't. So I suspect in collections around the country, for people who have either the stick pins, the lapel pins, or the buttons, that they may or may not have hallmarks. But the distinguishing thing here is the shape of the fleur-de-lis on these early Foley pins. And these didn't last long because the design was kind of crude. So quickly, let me talk about one others. For some reason, Foley made this really odd pin, and they called it a tie pin. And you can see on the right-hand side how you actually wear this thing. It clips on the top of your dress tie. Now, I've tried wearing these, and I usually get this thing poked into my neck. Later on, and I'll show you when we get to a sterling set, they actually figured out that this thing was upside down, and they made it with the clasp so that it actually clipped onto the bottom of the tie rather than the top of the tie. But again, these were called tie pins. And again, they came in all the different colors. But very quickly, somebody realized we need a better design. So then Foley created the next set. Again, all the different colors, but this time they got a really nice design with a good fleur-de-lis. But again, all of these pins are flat. They're not multidimensional. They were stamped just like a coin is made, and then they were filled with the glass, and then they were fired. So they're smooth surface pins. The backs of these now get kind of interesting because the Foley hallmark appears. And you'll notice it's raised. It's not stamped in, it's raised, which you can do when you're making a double stamp side so that you get the impression on the front side of the copper and you force the impression on the back side of the copper. And again, the lapel pins in this particular design with the nicer fleur-de-lis sometimes had a hook and sometimes had a spin lock clasp on them. And then the buttons, again, in this case, had the big round nut that went on them, but these were also hallmarked. And again, you can see that I've got pictures of two lapel pins here, one with hallmark, one without hallmark. Again, fairly common in the early days. Some stuff was hallmark, some stuff wasn't hallmark. As a collector, if you like hallmarks, great. I can tell you in this kind of jewelry, you're lucky to even find them, much less if you're trying to find them with a specific hallmark or not hallmark, especially when you're trying to collect all the different colors. So, and again, these came in the scarf pins, sometimes called stick pins, and they were available in all the colors. Again, with and without hallmarks. We're not sure if there was a specific scheme or as to whether they should or should not have hallmarks. But again, what they did do was, if you'll notice, the scarf pin and the lapel pins, they're all the exact same pins. All they did was put different findings, whether it be a pin, a lapel pin, a post with a thread, or a stick pin. They used the same pin and die and then just attached a different finding so that they all appeared and looked alike. Okay, so that's the end of what Foley offered, because sometime around 1915, something happened to Foley. And we're not totally sure, and Mitch has got some ideas here as to what happened to Foley. But you know, there's not a lot of historical records. I know Mitch has interviewed some of the family members. And Mitch, if you've got, you know, any real hard information on what happened to Foley, you can share it.
It's again, something happened to him. I'm thinking that he went out of business went bankrupt, just from the standpoint that when he came back, 1918, he stopped marking his stuff Foley.
Right.
Which is making me think that if it was just a fire or something else, he wouldn't have a reason to hide his company name. But I could not document that anywhere.
Yeah.
Best I could document was starting in 1918 when there was a new company started, Standard Emblem Company. It was owned by Thomas H. Foley in New York City.
Yep. So if anybody out there has, you know, any knowledge about Foley, you know, we'd love to hear it. We'd love to, you know, try to, you know, nail down what actually happened, because and around 1915, something changed. And West had to go find a new supplier. He already had a little bit of relationship with his new supplier, but that's Dejas and Clust, still in New York, but now they're about 3 miles away. So the travel is a little bit harder. For those of you, this is, you know, Manhattan. And yes, this is today, but, you know, imagine, you know, back in the mid-teens era, you know, you still had to travel a little bit. There was a lot of jewelry companies in the Manhattan area. A lot of people offering this type of jewelry. West, for some reason, chose Dejas and Clust. Again, we have no idea why. We can probably bet it had something to do with price. So Dejas and Clust comes onto into the fold. And the first thing we have to do is Dejas now has to replace and reproduce all of these small enameled badges. You can see I don't have a white one in my collection, so I can't show it. The interesting thing is down in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the difference between the engravers at Dejas and Clust and the engravers at Foley. The guys at Dejas and Clust were fine jewelers. They did a lot more detail. So when you look at the pins that Dejas made, they're a much higher quality and much finer detail, whether that be in the eagle's head, whether that be in the wings, or whether that be in the application of the actual enamel. Dejas did a much better job. And again, you get all kinds of shade variations in these greens and reds and so forth. Again, Dejas also made the lapel pins and the lapel buttons, but instead of making them flat, like Foley made them, they made them three-dimensional, or what's called multi-dimensional. So the shields are raised, the wings are raised, the enamel is recessed. These are much finer crafted pieces of jewelry. Okay, and again, all the different colors were available depending upon your particular position. The backs, the lapel pins have a spin lock finding. Most of the ones that I have seen or own have the Dejas and Clust. There are some that are unmarked that have a plain back. The button pins, for some reason, did not. Some of them don't have the hallmarking, but they put the hallmarking on the finding. Now, Dejas didn't make their own findings. Okay, they purchased them, but they purchased the finding from the Victor Company, and then they had the outer cap of it stamped with their name. So these were used for more than just scouting. This was Dejas's standard finding for small pinbacks. So you can actually find these Dejas and Clust nuts, if you will, on other jewelry, that if you have a button pin, you could find the nut from another Deeges piece that you could put it together, and it would be an original piece. Also, stick pins. Deeges made all the different colors. They hallmarked some of them. They didn't hallmark them all. But the interesting thing that Deeges did here that's different than Foley is when you take and fold a scarf around your neck and you put the pin in it, those Foley pins, being smooth, would sometimes slide out. So Deeges put a rib in theirs so that it actually had a tendency to stay on the scarf. Again, all the different colors available depending upon which position you had. And again, these were raised. So the same pin, whether it be on a stick pin, whether it be on a lapel pin or a button pin, it was the same pin with just a different finding on the back. Now, because scouting had a little bit of change in the 1915, 1916 period, in addition to these pins, Deeges created the pins with the wreaths in them. So you got the Scout Commissioner now with a wreath in the dark blue, or and that's a button pin and a lapel pin and a stick pin, or you've got the lapel pin with the cutout with the wreath with the stick pin. And you can see sometimes they hallmarked them, sometimes they didn't hallmark them, sometimes they put the finding at the top, sometimes they put the finding in the middle. You'll find a lot of variation out there. And again, as a pin collector, you can feel yourself lucky if you get the front. Don't worry about so much of, do you have the one that has the hallmark, not have the hallmark? You can go that fine, but there are so few of these out there in the collecting community. Also, in addition to the blue, there was the white. The white was for the Scout Executive. And you'll notice, I say this is 15 to 19 because in the last period of Deeges making these, which we'll see in just a moment, instead of having the three-dimensional raised shield, raised wings, they went to a flat front, okay? Because, again, I suspect it had something to do with cost and the maintaining of dies. So from here, around 18, we went to what are, you find pretty common, and these go into the 20s. And I put 20 on this because that's when we're ending tonight. We're not looking at the 20s. But again, all the different colors in these little teeny pins, now they have a perfectly flat, smooth front. We're back to the stamping, die pressing, if you will, and then the enamel being put into these pins. And you see a lot of this era of these different pins, okay? Now, in addition to these, what Deeges also did was they went to, for the lapel pin and the stick pins, they went to a flat front. Okay, this is the last series of the Deeges pins. They're all flat. They're really thick in stamping. So this metal in these pins is much thicker than the earlier pins. The early pins are really thin copper. These are much, much thicker. I haven't found a whole lot of these pins compared to the early ones. So that's the reason I only have a few here in the collection. I don't know what Mitch has in his or Mike Feigenbaum has in his. I do know other examples exist of different positions. Okay. Then that's all of the enamel, pretty much, and with the exception of what might be prototypes. But this is the production stuff that scouting could buy. This was all adult insignia. This is where scouting wanted adults to wear this stuff, promote the organization. So what about the boys? What about scouts? Well, they had a different option. So for first class scouts, they could purchase sterling silver jewelry that they could wear as a first class scout. Now they've got cufflinks, they've got the stick pin, which I guess maybe the mom wore, I'm not sure. And then they have that oval, which is actually a tie pin, which I'll show you the clasp in a second. And then there was a button version that has the post on it with the screw. You'll see the back of that in a moment. So they sold 3 pieces as a set, and then you could buy the buttons separately. Now, the very earliest ones had 5 stars in the shield. In 1924, they converted to 3 stars in the shield. These are the backs. So you can see they're all sterling, and you can see that funny tie clasp thing. Only now, instead of it clipping at the top, it clips at the bottom of the tie. So you could wear it on your tie. And again, this was designed for first class scouts. Now, not leaving out all scouting, they also produced a set for tenderfoot in second class. It only had the universal emblem on it. There was not a second class version. This was sold to second class and first class scouts. I'm not sure how many tenderfoot and second class scouts bought sterling silver jewelry. If anybody out there has the other pieces, I'd love to get photographs because I don't have photographs of the other pieces. But yeah, first class scout, I can understand spending money and buying sterling. But as a tenderfoot, buying sterling jewelry, that's kind of high end. So that's my introduction in what, kind of 35 minutes or so, 30 minutes of the early jewelry that scouting used to promote itself. Again, think of West figuring out that he could create this high-end stuff that he could get people to buy and then get people to wear and promote the organization. So it really didn't cost scouting anything. Great promotional campaign. Mitch, you got any thoughts you can add?
No, you did an awesome job with that. The only thing that I'm not 100% sure is I know starting in 18, Standard Emblem Company started making stuff. What happened, best I can put together, was that Foley, for whatever reason, in 15 disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
In 18, he came back and he went back to the Boy Scouts and said, "Hey, I'm back here now. I'm back in business. Give me back your business." And they were already using Deegis and Clust for a lot of their stuff. But what I ended up doing is I bought a collection years ago from a woman whose sister-in-law had worked in a plant in Rhode Island. And the woman remembers going to visit her sister in New York City, and the name of the person she worked for was Mr. Foley. So that's how this whole thing kind of tied back together again. Years ago, I wrote an article in Scout Collectors Quarterly, and so it kind of talks about how this whole thing we put together. We found out that the plants that they use to make this jewelry are really like a small room.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they had one little room inside of a big building, and really what they need is they need a kiln and some ways to melt the glass that they're putting on it, and they needed a way to adhere the pins onto it. And almost everything that was made by Standard Emblem Company was not hallmarked.
Mm-hmm.
It was really surprising because I had stuff like on the early contest medals and other things, or some of it would be marked Deegis and Clust, and you look and the metal looks identical or almost identical, and it was not marked. And that was all the Standard Emblem Company stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the interesting thing here is, and nobody knows the answer, is since this stuff was stamped and it's stamped like a coin, did actually Foley or even Deegis do the stamping, or did they outsource the stamping and then actually apply the glass and the finding? It's an interesting question that we have no idea the answer
Yeah,
to.
I can't tell you on that one, but I know some of the stuff that they had. They definitely had stuff to put parts together.
Mhm.
So you'd have all the findings. I had one of the part stuff in the box were these brass rods that were about maybe 8-10 inches long, and they were with they had like a little tip on the end where they could solder it on. I'm sure that was probably what was being bent to make the pins.
Mhm.
So again, I'm not sure on, again, with the unmarked stuff from 1918 on, again, if it was, some of it could have been Deegers and Cluss, some of it might have been Standard Emblem Company.
Yep.
Because again, I found some of these things, like the two clasped lapel pins or
Mhm.
hat pins with 2 spin wheels on them instead of 1. I had a few of them in my collection before I bought the stuff from the woman, and there was more of that in there.
Mhm. Yep. So the only ones we absolutely know for sure are the ones that are hallmarked.
Yep.
And the really early ones with the odd Foley tenderfoot design, we know those. But like Mitch says, when we get into that 1918 era, when things are not marked, there's still some unknown because there's no way to look at purchase orders, there's no way to look at anything, and there's no records. So we're just going by here's what we know and here's what it might be. What I will ask you guys to do is, if you have any of these pins, other than Mitch, because I know Mitch has got a bunch of them, if you've got any of these pins, I'd love to get photographs of what you have of the fronts and backs so we can continue to document those. And you could either take them with your iPhone or take them with a camera or whatever, but if you could send those to me at Ron Oslin at Boy Scout Insignia, that would be fantastic. So that we can learn more and share more. Mitch and I have had lots of conversations over first class pins and second class pins, and it's amazing what we have been able to discover and put together by sharing what we both have and what we both have in our collections. And I give a lot of credit to Mitch and all the research he's done, because he's learned a lot and shared a lot over time, and I've appreciated that. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope that was helpful and meaningful for folks.
I'd like to add 3 things based on your conversation. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I'm not sure 1918 was the date, but after the Foley company went out of business, the Standard Emblem company kept on making the rank pins, as you know.
Yes.
Into the early 30s.
Mhm.
And I believe the reason they didn't put their name on it was the BSA didn't want to give them any credit. They wanted to promote themselves. Okay. They wanted their name on it. They didn't want advertisement from a jewelry company. Now, as you know, Mitch, there were these weird tenderfoot and first class pins in between that period, because apparently the Boy Scouts America went to another company to see if they can make the tenderfoot and first class pins, at least those. And of course, when they order something, it doesn't come in right, they just can't return it, because the order, they pay the money, they get the samples, they get it, and that's it. And they weren't going to throw it in the garbage pail, so they distributed it until they ran out of it. And I think both of you know the pins I'm talking about.
Yep.
There are some tenderfoot pins and a first class pin with some of it missing on the second class part of it, and the eagles are very strange. The other thing I want to say is, it's a standard thing in the jewelry business to job out different parts of your product. It's a long-standing tradition in Switzerland that the watch company doesn't make totally the watch. They go to a company to make the handles, to make the face, to make the inner movement, and to make the casing, and they assemble it. And it's the same thing in the jewelry business. There's a person who casts this, or stamps it, and then there's a person who polishes it, and then there's a person who solders or welds on the findings. Okay, so not the same company does everything. They job it out to specialists, and so those. So I think I covered the three things that the Standard Emblem Company kept on going. In between, there were two companies that made tenderfoot and first class pins. I'm not sure about the second class pins. And then in the jewelry business, a number of companies do their specialties to put things together. Even today, when you go to the jewelry district and you want something done, you have to go to get it cast, to get it polished from a separate jobber, to get it plated, you know, all the people doing specialty work. So that's my contribution to the conversation.
Perfect.
And Mike, I specifically didn't want to get into the pins that were part of the uniform wear, because then we get into, like you talk about, we have to get into all the
But when
Foley,
you
the
speak about the
Rikers.
Standard Emblem Company,
Yeah.
you have to, and you talked about how they continued, I had to bring that in,
Yep.
because the Standard Emblem Company, or Foley, kept on making the BSA tenderfoot second and first class pins.
Yeah, and the little first class pins that are for like Scoutmaster, Assistant Scoutmaster, and so forth, that were made into the 20s. I have a suspicion those were made by Standard Pennant rather than Digis in the 20s.
What was that? Standard what?
The little, you know, the little teeny first class cutout pins that
Yeah.
continued into the 20s that were colored for different positions. I think Standard Pennant made those rather than Digis, but I don't know for sure.
The other thing I want to say to you is that Digis and Clust actually was there at the beginning. They made the Star and Life pins before 1914. In
Yes.
1912, 1913, they were making the Star and Life badges only came in pins, and only in 1914 did they finally make the patches. So Digis and Clust was supplying the BSA from the beginning on certain things, because the Star and Life pins were considered jewelry, while the tenderfoot second and first was considered something else.
Yeah, and Digis and Clust was more of a fine jeweler compared to Foley, that was more into metals and other stuff.
And eventually they got more work when they got the Eagle Scout medal and the honor medals, you know, the second version of the honor medals.